happy to join the African Society of Cambridge University on this 21st day of May, which is 4 days shy of the date that is celebrated as the African Day, the 25th day of May. I would have loved to be with you in person, but for reasons beyond my control, I can only interact through technology. But that notwithstanding, let me start by congratulating you for organizing this conference which focuses on the mother continent. I'm aware that you are in foreign lands to acquire knowledge. Indeed, it cannot be gainsaid that the cross-pollination and cross-fertilization of knowledge is the mother's milk of sustainable development. And it gladdens my heart that even as far removed as you are from the mother continent, she is still in your hearts and minds, giving meaning to the immortal words of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, that one is not an African because one is born in Africa, but because Africa is born in him or her. On this occasion, when we talk about a re-emergence of the continent of Africa, many things come to mind, and it is undeniable that a proper examination of the circumstances of Africa and our future cannot be undertaken without some reference to history. Many of us know that this is a continent that has had a glamorous history. Indeed, when history is recorded, it cannot be denied that Africa is the cradle of human civilization. And that is why the continent has always been attractive to all civilizations. The Arabs were here, the Chinese were here, the Turks were here, the British were here, the French were here, the Portuguese were here, the Belgians were here, the Germans were here. Africa is a magnet of undeniable proportions. The tragedy of the continent, however, is that those who have looked towards her have always looked towards her for the purpose of plunder. They came here to enslave us, and when slavery had lost its luster, the colonial project took root, and subsequently the neo-colonial project. And this is what gives legitimacy to the subject of our engagement today, the re-emergence of Africa. This is a subject that has preoccupied many African patriots over the years. Marcus Garvey talked about it when he started the Black Star movement. South Africa's Pixley Kaisaka Seme gave one of the most iconic speeches on the 5th day of April in the year 1906 at the University of Columbia with a fitting title, The Regeneration of Africa. I can still hear the words of Pixley Kaisaka Seme telling his audience on that day that Africa was great and must be great again. Beyond the speech of Pixley Kaisaka Seme, many of us will remember that Africa suffered the misfortune of being divided by the European powers. 1884, 1885 has been described by the Nigerian Adekeye Adebajo as the curse of Berlin. We remember during those few months, the European powers sat in Berlin in Germany, and they divided the mother continent without due regard to cultures. The British took their share, the Germans took their share, the Italians took their share, the Portuguese took their share, the French took their share, the Spaniards took their share, the Dutch took their share. That was the curse of Berlin. And it's unfortunate that even when the struggle to regain independence started in earnest in the 1940s, it is a divided Africa that was clamoring for independence. 55 countries we are today, courtesy of arbitrarily drawn boundaries which have occasioned pain to the mother continent. This is the state in which we find ourselves. Many of you will remember great Africans during the struggle for independence, promising Africans of the day that when we regain our independence, we are going to liberate our people from the chains of poverty, disease, and ignorance. And they fought across the continent. In West Africa, the passionate words of the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah still ring true on the occasion of the independence of Ghana, that the independence of Ghana means nothing if the rest of Africa is not free. And it was not only the Osagie who was speaking at that time. Many voices could be heard. Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea, Leopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, Julius Kambarage Nyerere in Tanzania, in Uganda, Apollo Milton Obote, in Zambia, Kenneth David Kaunda, in Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in Algeria, Ahmed Ben Bella, and subsequently we know the struggles in Angola of Agostinho Neto, in Mozambique of Samora Moises Machel, and the struggle against apartheid by Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, and of course in Namibia, Sam Luyomba and Andimba Haman Toivo, Ya Toivo, among others. Many they were. Julius Kambarage Nyerere reminded us that unity is at the very heart of our quest for re-emergence. And when we talk about unity, it is critical that we remind ourselves that as a continent, the whole idea of unity and regeneration started as early as 1963. I remember that even before 1963, in the year 1960, the then leaders of independent African countries gathered in Casablanca, Morocco, and rededicated themselves to the quest for Africa's recovery and Africa's regeneration. So that when African leaders met in the month of May, from the 23rd through to the 25th days of May in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, there were many speeches that were delivered. I can still remember the speeches of Haile Selassie, who was the host of the day, telling his audience that Africa had a duty to herself. I can remember the speech of Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere, reminding his audience that they were not gathered in Addis Ababa to remind themselves of the significance of unity, because unity was mandatory. I can remember the 32 speeches iconic, passionately delivered. But the most iconic of them was the immortal speech of Ghana's Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah reminded his audience on that day that if Africa did not unite, she would be susceptible to manipulation. He reminded his audience on that day that the apparent death of the colonial project was a harbinger for yet another project, the neo-colonial project. He reminded his audience that the only way in which Africa could immunize herself from the neo-colonial project was through unity. Not in so many words, but in effect, the Osagyefo said, let us today come out of this meeting with a single army. Let us come out of this meeting with a single currency. Let us come out of this meeting with a United States of Africa. Let us come out of this meeting having agreed on which city would be the capital of Africa. And I remember him saying, from where I sit, Bangui in Central African Republic, or Leopoldville, as Kinshasa was then called, should be the capital, but I'm open to other suggestions. The Osagyefo did not carry the day, because in the run-up to the meeting in Addis Ababa, the neo-colonialists had started to divide Africans, so that when the meeting was convened in Addis Ababa, there was the Casablanca group, the group that believed that unity was urgent and necessary. And there was the Monrovia group, which believed that unity should be gradual. How sad that on that day, the Monrovia group won. And we ended up with an organization, the Organization of African Unity. It played its part. It cannot be denied. But it was a loose and weak organization. The neo-colonialists had succeeded. The British had formed their own Commonwealth, which was a loose association of our former colonies, complete with the British monarch as the titular head. It survives today. The French had formed their own Francophonie body to ensure that French culture and dominance was perpetuated. You know that the Portuguese did not live easy, but they too still continue to operate in the continent of Africa. And they did not stop there, because after the World War II, the new powers also emerged. The United States of America was the new hegemon, and another pretending hegemon was the Soviet Union. So once again, the continent of Africa became a theater of the Cold War, with some gravitating toward the United States of America and the conceptual West, and some gravitating toward the Soviet Union, and some even towards China. That was our continent. She had been enslaved. She had been colonized. She is now neo-colonialized. That is our state. And that is why it is legitimate on an occasion such as this to talk about her re-emergence. Because how can it be that a continent which is the most endowed with natural resources is the poorest on earth? How can it be that 1.4 billion Africans are still eating crumbs from under the table? How can it be? How can it be that we continue to be manipulated? How can it be that in multilateral organizations we still continue to play the gooseberry? So that if you go to the United Nations, not a single African country is a member who is permanent. We can vote all we want at the United Nations, but a single veto vote from China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, or the United States neutralizes our vote. That is our state. How can it be that our entire continent, at the very best, our gross domestic product, which is not necessarily the best index of measuring economic well-being, is less than that of the Federal Republic of Germany? How can it be? There is therefore urgency that we must do something to rise from the muck and mire of sorrow and lamentation. And this we can only do if we search our souls. It is Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o, on a different note, who said that as a condition precedent to the realization of the true African dream, we must decolonize our minds. And the great John Henry Clark of the United States of America, an African American, said that as long as Africans continue to mimic systems of governance that they inherited from the erstwhile colonizers, Africa will never realize our potential. So what is it that we must do? What is it that we must put in place so that Africa can re-emerge? I remember in 1996, former head of state of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, said about Africans, saying, "I am an African." If we are truly Africans, and if we recognize that politically we are weak, if we recognize that economically we are weak, if we recognize that culturally we are under threat, if we recognize that technologically we are weak, if we recognize that we did not participate in the first industrial revolution, if we recognize that we did not earn the dividends of the second industrial revolution, if we recognize that we did not earn the dividends of the third industrial revolution, if we recognize that we are in danger of losing out on the fourth industrial revolution, if we recognize that we live in a world where nanotechnology, we talk about the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, we must ask ourselves the fundamental question: how can we do it? It is not lost on me that education is at the very heart of it. But what kind of education? Mwalimu Nyerere asked in 1966. If it is true that we must struggle, Samora Moises Machel asked in 1980s, a luta continua contra que? The struggle continues, but for what? We must answer those questions in the affirmative. Education, from where I sit, has been the mother's milk of human progress. But what kind of education? Remember that when the colonizer came into the continent, the kind of education that was handed down to us was designed to indoctrinate us, was designed to make us good tools for the colonial project. And I suspect that we inherited that kind of education, and many times the education that we are handing down to ourselves may not liberate us, may not make us regenerate, may not make us re-emerge. You will remember with me, students of Cambridge, of African origin, the book written in 1933 by the African-American Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. Is it possible that we are so thoroughly miseducated that we are incapable of changing our continent positively? Do you remember it being said that the puppeteer need not worry about the puppet once he or she knows how the puppet will be manipulated? Is there such a danger? And if there is, you who have the advantage of gaining education in foreign lands, what is it that we can do in the arts in order to change Africa positively? When I look at the world, it is still true that we Africans have the short hand of the stick. What can we do with our arts so that we can reemerge? We still gravitate towards the arts and the creativity of Hollywood and sometimes Bollywood. But it gladdens my heart today that in that arena we are beginning to think differently. Nigeria now has her Nollywood. Tanzania her Bongowood. Kenya her Riverwood. Because when we change our culture, it will restore our self-esteem. Once we have self-esteem, there is no limit to what we can do. You are in Cambridge. Read the words written by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his book, The River Between, when his lead character, Wayaki, is told to go yonder and learn the ways of the white man, but to come back home and make sure that it's used for the benefit of the people of Africa. I look forward to your coming back to Africa to influence the arts. I look forward to Africa engaging meaningfully in the sciences. How can it be that we are a continent that only consumes that which we do not produce and produces that which we do not consume? Mahatma Ali Mazrui. How can it be that in the 21st century we are producers of primary products? Our coffee is packaged elsewhere, our tea is packaged elsewhere, our diamonds are cut elsewhere, our gold is traded elsewhere, our uranium is traded elsewhere, our coal is traded elsewhere. What can we do in science and technology? In the pharmaceuticals, how can it be that our sick men and women must rely on pharmaceutical companies in the West and progressively in China and other parts of the world? What can we do? What can we do to ensure that we have the advantage of nanotechnology and mobile telephony? How can it be that we cannot have this? Because even for those who are spiritually inclined, the divine instruction was, go ye and subdue the world. The world appears to have subdued us. We must re-emerge, and we can only re-emerge when we seize the opportunities that are available to us. You know, we are a divided continent. And there is a sense in which when I travel across the continent of Africa, I hear young men and women saying, we must unite, because unity will be the guarantor of our development. I can't agree with them all. At the continental level, I'm beginning to see the realization that that is the condition sine qua non to the re-emergence of Africa. I see the Southern Africans in SADC coming up, 16 countries, and saying, we must aggregate our efforts. I see the Eastern Africans saying the same thing. I see the Central Africans saying the same thing. I see the West Africans saying the same thing. I see the Maghreb saying the same thing. I see the Horn of Africa saying the same thing. But I'm not satisfied. I'll only be satisfied when we give meaning to the exhortation of the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah, when he spoke on the 25th day of May, the year 1963. You know, when one reads or listens to the Osagie, one recognizes how far-sighted he was. And as if to say, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Several years down the line, many Africans now recognize that he was right. Speaking on the 6th day of March, 1997, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the independence of Ghana, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere said, the rest of the world does not care about your Ghanaianness, your Tanzanianness, your Kenyanness, your Ugandanness, your Namibianness. They only know about Africa. And therefore, unity is what we must give its pride of place. And on that occasion, Mwalimu Nyerere said, when Nkrumah spoke in 1963, some of us were dragging our feet. We must not now apologize to Kwame Nkrumah. He was right. We should have united then, because now unity has become a lot more difficult. We have politicians who have emerged, who have now gotten used to the trappings of power, and it will be very difficult for them to cede power for the united Africa. They will want to continue to be big fish in small ponds. Nyerere spoke thus. And I remember in the year 2013, the then chair of the African Union, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma of South Africa, wrote an imaginary letter to the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah saying, we apologize because you are right, you could see what we did not see even in those early days. Africans now know that in order to re-emerge, we must unite. We must do things differently. And that is how I understand what happened in the year 2000 when the Organization of African Unity transformed itself into the African Union. The agenda was that we will begin to do things differently. And the Africa must say that it is underperforming. It is underachieving. But perhaps I'm judging her too early. But was it not said by the great Chinua Achebe that the chick that will grow into a cock is known on the day that it hatches. And I believe that is true of one that will grow into a hen. It is known on the day that it hatches. If that be the case, what are the building blocks that are now in place? The African Union came up with Africa Agenda 2063. But allow me a little history in order for me to explain why we must be on our guard. Prior to Agenda 2063, there was the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980. And under the Lagos Plan of Action, the political leaders of Africa undertook at that time that Africa had to begin to trade more with herself. That Africa had to begin to cut the umbilical cord that continues to tie her with the neo-colonial powers. That Africa has to do things differently. The Lagos Plan of Action died on arrival. I pray and hope that Africa Agenda 2063, founded on 7 pillars, will not suffer a similar fate. But it requires our vigilance, our combined vigilance. Because if Africa Agenda 2063 is to be realized, Africans will liberate themselves from poverty. Africans will liberate themselves from cultural domination. Africa will liberate herself from sorrow and want, because Africa will add value to her natural resources. Africa will ensure that she uses education to infuse change in her affairs. Africa will become a power in the world so that she is listened to. That is what Agenda 63 wishes that we achieve as a continent, so that we can re-emerge again, so that we do not continue to glorify our history while our present and past has nothing to write home about. Africa today recognizes, and that is why the Africa Continental Free Trade Area came into being in the year 2021. And I hope that under the African Continental Free Trade Area, we will be able to trade amongst ourselves. If you look at all the continents of the world, it is only the continent of Africa that does not enjoy that trade. And trade is the lifeblood of human development. So I look forward to the day when the Continental Free Trade Area will allow one who is in Dakar, Senegal, to have his or her goods transported to Djibouti in the Horn of Africa, and one who is in Mpumalanga in South Africa will ensure that her goods are moved to Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, and there will be no tariff and tariff barriers, and not tariff and non-tariff barriers. I look forward to the day when not a single African will require a visa to visit another African country. I look forward to the day when the 33 odd currencies that we have will no longer be there, that will have only one currency, name it what you will. I call it Afro. I look forward to that day. I look forward to the day when Africans will be able to move and own land wherever they are able to acquire it. I look forward to that day. I look forward to the day when we are able to engage in commerce, when our continent is rising, when our young men and women do not have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, when our young men and women will not be humiliated at embassies of Western countries in search of visas. I look forward to that day. I look forward to the day when our young men and women will not be humiliated in the Arab world as they are engaged in what is essentially latter-day slavery. I look forward to that day. And in order to achieve all these things, all of us, you who are now in Cambridge, in the United Kingdom, acquiring knowledge. This is the day on which you must take a solemn vow. A vow that you have gone into those lands to acquire knowledge, that you may come to Africa and change Africa. And it's not only those of you who are in Cambridge, all who are learning in Europe and America, in China and other parts of the world. We look forward to the day when you'll make a solemn vow that it shall not be again that we shall be manipulated. You'll take a solemn vow that we shall not be insulted. You shall take a solemn vow that we shall not be victimized by poverty. You shall take a solemn vow that Africa shall re-emerge. You'll take a solemn vow that you'll do the right thing for the mother continent. I agree with Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere as he spoke on the 6th day of March, 1997. The struggle to liberate Africa, the struggle to regenerate Africa is not for the faint-hearted and is intergenerational. One generation will run their leg and hand over the baton to another generation. The struggle to liberate and to regenerate Africa is not for the faint-hearted. In that struggle, we will make many mistakes, and indeed, many mistakes have been made. But as Mwalimu said, of all the mistakes we have made, the single one that we must never make is the mistake of despair, the mistake of giving up. It can be done. You and me, during our lifetime, we have seen countries or read about countries that had been destroyed, that had been rendered into ashes, and they regenerated. History will teach you about Germany in 1945, bombed to the ground. Today, it is the third largest economy in the world. It can be done. If the Germans did it, why can we not do it? You will remember Japan bombed, atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It has risen again. It is our cars that kiss the African soil. If the Japanese can do it, why can't we do it in Africa? You'll remember South Korea, 1953, the war that they fought. They have regenerated. If the South Koreans can do it, why can we not do it? You'll remember Vietnam. If the Vietnamese can do it, why can we not do it? And even in the mother continent, many of you will remember the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. But the Rwandese, like the phoenix, are emerging from their very ashes. Go to Botswana. They are emerging. But we cannot re-emerge disunited as we are. We cannot re-emerge if there is war in the Sahelian region, if there is unrest in Burkina Faso, if there is unrest in Chad, if there is unrest in Mali, if there is disquiet in Cameroon, in Amazonia, if there is disquiet in Nigeria, if there is disquiet in Central African Republic, if there is disquiet in Eastern Congo, if there is disquiet in Somalia, if there is disquiet in Mozambique, if there is disquiet in Darfur, if there is disquiet in Algeria, if there is disquiet in South Sudan and in Sudan, it cannot re-emerge. So one of the things that we must do is, as we promised ourselves and failed to achieve in the year 2020, we must silence the guns. We must silence the guns. Because if we don't silence the guns, then all our efforts will be rendered useless. We must also begin to produce food, because if we do not silence the guns, we will not feed ourselves. And if we cannot feed ourselves, we'll be sick. And if we are sick, we don't even have the pharmaceutical products. If there was one thing that exposed our underbelly, it was COVID-19. We were there, begging the world. If it was not Moderna that we were begging Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson or Sputnik or Sinovac. We must stop it. We will only stop it if we are united. And this we must do as an urgent enterprise, because fortune waits for no man. And no amount of prayer and fasting is going to liberate Africa. That which requires to be done through technology, as I've said and I say again, will not be achieved through theology. We are not going to pray Africa into re-emergence. We are not going to pray Africa into regeneration. Pray we must. But we must roll up our sleeves, because God is still right. It is by the sweat of our brow that we shall eat. I can go on and on, but the wisdom of the occasion demands that I say, it will be done, but only if we work at it. And our promise to each other, our solemn vow here, is to say with the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah, let us now redouble our efforts. Let us not look left nor right. Let us not look west nor east. Let us look forward, and look forward in the knowledge that we can make Africa great again. Thank you, and God bless.